Isaiah 50, verse 10, "Who is among you that fears the Eternal, that obeys the voice of his servant, and that walks in darkness and has no light?" Who is it that fears God? Who is it that obeys God's servant? Who is it that walks in darkness? The answer is nobody. If we are doing it God's way, if we really believe God's way is right and living our life that way, and if we are obeying his servant, Mr. Armstrong, then we're not going to be walking in darkness. We're not going to be blind spiritually. We're going to be able to move out and get the job done and go to a place in the wilderness and go on into the kingdom, just as those who followed Moses in the wilderness. Did they follow Moses in the wilderness? Or didn't they follow God, who was in a pillar of fire and smoke? No, we don't have to judge Moses. We don't have to question Samuel or vote him out of office. And neither do we have to judge Mr. Armstrong or vote him out of office. He is the servant of God. And when we obey Mr. Armstrong, we are obeying not a human being or a man as such. We are obeying the servant of the living God. And unless we are obeying that servant, we are going to be blind spiritually, and we're not going to be here much longer. We were all appalled when Mr. Ted Armstrong went out of the church, and yet Mr. Herbert Armstrong had deliberately commanded him to do something or not to preach. It was a command. He did not obey the voice of God's servant, and he's not with us today. One woman called me, or I called her, see why she wasn't coming to church, and she says, "Look, if I hear Mr. Armstrong say, or anybody say that Mr. Armstrong is an apostle one more time, I'm going to go through the ceiling." Well, I gave her a chance. I didn't hear any splintered timbers or any jet blast or anything. She didn't go. But she refused Mr. Armstrong as the servant of God, as an apostle, one sent by God. And she's no longer with us. She's no longer one of those precious jewels that God is working for. The flaw went too deep. It was too difficult to get out. She wouldn't give it a chance. Well, let's go back to Malachi again. Chapter 3 again. You know, God realizes here that unless we are willing to obey his servant and follow that servant that he has placed above us, if we're going to question that servant, then we are questioning Christ. We're going to reject God as the Israelites did. And God knows that if we're going to reject the servant, then indeed if Christ tells us to do something, we're going to reject Christ, aren't we? And we're going to go to God the Father and say, "Well, Father, I don't like what Christ is doing." That is, if we're God too in the kingdom. And indeed, if we don't like what God commands us to do, we're going to be like Satan and try to take over. And God isn't going to allow that, is he? So you're not going to make it into the kingdom. You just won't be there. Here in Malachi 3, verse 16, it said, "Then they that feared the Eternal spoke often one to another." Do you discuss God's word and God's way? You'd better do it. "And the Lord hearkened and heard it, and a book of remembrance was written before him for them that feared the Eternal, and that thought upon his name. And they shall be mine, saith the Lord of hosts, in that day when I make up my jewels, when I gather my treasury together. And I will spare them as a man spares his own son that serves him. And then you shall return and discern between the righteous and the wicked." You're going to be given a chance to help the righteous. You're going to be given a chance to help the wicked. "Between him that serves God and him that serves not." But you see, it's going to take a powerful, dedicated attitude on our part, isn't it? And as I say, like the man who beat his child and lost that child, we don't have a decade to wait. We don't have another year to wait. We've got to be working on ourselves right now. Mr. Armstrong says the church needs to be cleaned up. He's emphasizing this in the past 6 months. Will last just fewer months than that. And we'd better be cleaning on ourselves as well. Listen to that servant and obey him. Follow his example. Let's go to Zechariah.